Call of the Siren, a creatures of desire story about the risks of temptation. The Shearwater Passage had a reputation, and Tess Vael had always found reputations useful not for believing but for triangulating. Sailors who'd come through swore the currents ran wrong in the middle stretch, that compasses drifted, that you heard things. Tess had been sailing solo for 11 years. She'd heard plenty of things. The sea talked to itself constantly. You learned to distinguish signal from noise. She was 3 days out of Morrow's reach with a hold full of sealed crates addressed to nobody she'd ever meet, which was fine. She preferred cargo that didn't ask questions. The sloop, Selvin, 32 feet, bad-tempered in a crosswind, absolutely trustworthy in everything that mattered, cut through the passage chop with the ease of a thing that knew its own mind. Tess had her hand on the tiller and her eye on the horizon and a mug of cold tea she kept forgetting to drink. The feeling crept in somewhere around the second hour. Not a sound, that was the thing she'd remember later. It wasn't music, not exactly. It was more like certainty. A warm, unasked-for conviction that she was going the right direction, towards something she hadn't known she was missing but now couldn't doubt. She'd been adjusting the tiller for minutes before she noticed she'd altered course. She looked at the compass, looked at the horizon, looked at the angle of the sun. And she thought and corrected and felt the correction the way you feel the first cold of autumn, a wrongness against the skin. She corrected anyway. Tess Vael had not survived 11 years alone at sea by following feelings she couldn't name. The Islet appeared through haze 20 minutes later, and her first thought was there it is, warm and inevitable, and her second thought, half a second behind, fighting through gauze, was rocks, because there were rocks. Real ones, black and wet and vicious, breaking the surface in the shallows around the Islet's eastern face in a pattern that would hole Selvin in 3 places before Tess had time to swear. The feeling of rightness screamed at her to keep going, to trust it, and her hands and her gut and 11 years of scar tissue screamed something else entirely. She dropped the tiller hard to port, let the boom swing, scrambled forward to spill wind from the mainsail. Selvin protested with a shudder that went through the hull and up through Tess's feet and into her teeth. The keel found bottom, just a grinding scrape along rock that left a sound she'd hear in her sleep for weeks, and then they were past it, foam-white water on both sides, and Tess was hauling line and cursing fluently until she found the tiny cove on the Islet's western face, sheltered and deep enough, and got the anchor down. She sat on the deck for a moment with her hands between her knees, breathing. Then she checked the hull. The scrape was cosmetic. She was lucky, and she knew she was lucky, and she didn't like it. The island was small, a quarter-mile across, maybe, all gray rock and wind-scraped grass and a few twisted trees that had given up growing upright and gone sideways instead. Pretty in a stripped-back way. Tess climbed ashore more out of stubbornness than curiosity. She wanted to feel solid ground under her while the shaking wore off. That was when she saw the women. 3 of them picking their way over the rocks toward the cove. She nearly took a step back before she caught herself. She looked at them and felt something shift in her chest, uncomfortably, like furniture moved in a familiar room. Not that they were remarkable individually, though they were each in their way striking. It was more that they were somehow calibrated. The dark-haired one who moved like she owned the ground under her feet. The taller one with the careful eyes and the unhurried smile. The youngest seeming bright and salt-weathered and watching Tess with an open interest that Tess hadn't the first idea what to do with. You nearly went on the eastern rocks, the dark-haired one said. No preamble, Tess respected that. I noticed, Tess said. Most do not. She tilted her head. I'm Liz, that's Coral, Ven. Tess, she looked around the islet. You live here, we stay here, Liz said, which wasn't quite an answer, and Tess filed that away. The island was strange in the way that places are strange when they're too quiet, no birds, no insects, just wind over rock and the sound of her own breathing. But the women were warm company, warmer than Tess had expected from strangers in a place with a reputation, and after a while she stopped watching for the catch. They sat on flat rocks above the cove as the afternoon softened. Coral, the tall one with the careful eyes, asked questions that were exactly the right questions, not prying, not performative, just genuinely curious about the shape of Tess's life, what it was like to sail alone, whether she missed people or whether solitude was something you made peace with or whether it was something you'd chosen so long ago the choosing had become the self. Both, Tess said, after a pause long enough to mean she was actually thinking about it. I think both. Coral nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected and found it satisfying. Ven, the youngest seeming, the bright one, sat close enough that their shoulders touched, which Tess noticed and didn't move away from. She smelled like brine and something under it, something sweeter that Tess couldn't place. When she laughed at something Tess said, Tess felt disproportionately pleased. The light went amber. The feeling of rightness had faded to background hum. In its place was something that felt cautiously like ease. Liz brought her hand up to Tess's jaw and turned her face gently and kissed her. It was Tess had been kissed before, had wanted to be kissed and been disappointed in roughly equal measure. This was not that. This was unhurried and sure and warm, and when Liz pulled back there was no performance in her face, just attention. Yes, Liz said. Yes, Tess said. What followed had the quality of a dream, not in the sense of unreality, but in the sense of things fitting together in ways that waking life rarely managed. They moved to a hollow in the rocks above the cove, sheltered from the wind, where the grass was somehow soft and the stone was warm from the sun. Coral's hands were careful and patient. She undressed Tess with a focus that felt almost reverent, and Tess, who was not accustomed to being looked at that way, went still under her gaze and then slowly let herself be seen. Coral bent her head and kissed along Tess's collarbone, her shoulder, the curve of her breast, taking her time in a way that made Tess's breath come unsteady. Her mouth was warm, her hands knew what they were doing. By the time she brought Tess to the edge of herself and over it, slow, thorough, attentive in a way that felt almost like being studied, Tess had her fingers wound tight in Coral's hair and her eyes on the sky. Ven followed with laughter and bright energy, which was its own different kind of pleasure. She was less patient than Coral but more playful, and she knew how to use her hands in ways that made Tess gasp and then laugh and then gasp again. She kissed Tess's throat, her breasts, her stomach, and lower, and was so clearly delighted by everything she was doing that her delight became contagious. Tess buried her face in Ven's saltrough hair and let herself unravel, noisy and helpless, in a way she almost never permitted herself. Liz was last and was nothing like either of the others. She was slow the way deep water is slow, deliberate, sure of where she was going, allowing no hurry. She lay alongside Tess and looked at her for a moment first, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. Her hand moved between Tess's thighs with a patience that was almost cruel, reading her responses, adjusting, giving more and then less and then exactly enough. She watched Tess's face while she did it. Tess tried to hold her gaze and couldn't. She turned her face into Liz's shoulder and let the wave take her, and it took a long time to come back down. She lay in the grass afterward with the sky going purple above her and three women warm against her sides and thought, I have been alone for too long. It was a quiet thought, a true one. She held it carefully. The tide pool was what did it. Tess sat up while the others were still drowsy, reaching for her jacket, and caught her own reflection in a pool at the hollow's edge. Then naturally looked at the reflections of the three women behind her. Liz's reflection was wrong, not grotesquely wrong, not at first. Just wrong in the way a portrait is wrong when the painter has understood the face intellectually but missed something essential. The reflection's proportions were slightly off. The angles of the face didn't quite match. Tess went very still. She looked without looking, the way you look at a fixed star to see it clearly, slightly to the side of it. Coral's fingers, reaching to touch Tess's hair, were too long, were distinctly for just a moment too long, then they were ordinary fingers again. Ven's eyes caught the light. Not in the way eyes catch light, in the way tide pools catch light, deep and still and with nothing behind them. The warmth in Tess's chest went cold. The song, she recognized it now as a song, now that it was absent, had been quiet for hours. Without it, she could see. She'd spent 11 years learning to read the sea. Whether current, the way water moved over hidden rock. The sea lied constantly, and she was very good at catching it. She caught it now. She pulled her jacket on, kept her hands unhurried. Coral was watching her, Coral, who asked the right questions, who had understood the shape of her loneliness so precisely, so immediately that it had felt like being known. They read you, she thought, and they showed you what they read. I should check on the boat, Tess said. The boat is fine, Liz said, still warm, still sure. The warmth was real, she believed that somehow, which was the part she'd think about later. Whatever they were, the desire hadn't been performance. I know, Tess said. I want to check anyway. She walked to the cove at the pace of someone who wasn't afraid. She climbed aboard Selvin at the pace of someone who wasn't afraid. She got the anchor up at the pace of someone who was afraid and managing it correctly. They came to the shoreline as she was pushing off three shapes against the darkening rock, and she made the mistake of looking back. They were still wearing the faces she'd wanted, still standing exactly as women stand. Only the eyes, all three pairs, caught the last of the light in a way that had nothing human in it. One of them, Liz, called across the water, not the song, just words. Velanthari, she said, which Tess didn't understand then and looked up later and found it in an old Ethermore maritime glossary between Veil Wraith and Void Current. Those who give the shape of longing, sea changers, do not approach the islet. The current carried Selvin west. Tess corrected for the passage chop and didn't look back a second time. The open water was dark by the time she cleared the passage, stars sharp above the mast, the wake white behind her. Tess sat at the tiller and drank cold tea and thought about it the way she thought about close calls with weather, clinically, tracing each decision point, identifying what she'd done right and what she'd nearly done wrong. The loneliness had been real, the wanting had been real. The pleasure, and it had been pleasure, undeniably, her body wasn't going to pretend otherwise, that had been real too. Velanthari hadn't manufactured her desire. They'd only read it and reflected it back, and she'd walk toward it like light through fog. She adjusted her heading. The sea was the sea. She thought about Coral's careful questions and Ven's laughter and the particular deliberateness of Lys's hands. Thought about the tide pool and the fingers and the eyes. Thought, I have been alone for too long. Still true, still quiet. The stars moved overhead. Selving ran west by southwest, steady and reliable and asking nothing. Tess finished the cold tea, stood to shake out her legs, and went to adjust the sail. She'd be in Harrow Inlet by dawn. There was a woman there who ran the chandlery and had twice suggested dinner, and both times Tess had found a reason not to. She thought she might not find a reason this time. The end. Thank you for listening to another Creatures of Desire story. If you enjoyed it, please like this story so it finds its way to other listeners, and subscribe to the channel for more Sapphic tales of fantasy and romance.